When I had turned 18 in the early 90s, I didn't waste any time and began my life on the road. Ever since I was a little child, I had always been fascinated with the outdoors and other cultures. I wanted to travel the world, but I would start with the American West. And when I did, I went all in and really put myself out there. I was living in Northern California where I was raised. My plan was to hitchhike my way across Nevada, ultimately stopping in Colorado and attending a rainbow gathering they were having there the following month. If you don't know, a rainbow gathering is a group of like-minded people who come together in the forest every year in different locations around the US and the world. They like to celebrate peace and their unique lifestyles. I had saved up enough money doing odd jobs throughout the spring and had the whole summer to travel along my pre-planned route and just soak it all in. I could then attend college in the fall, though at the time I didn't really have any ideas what I wanted to study or major in. But all of that I would worry about later. Now I was ready to embrace this adventure and truly live my life. Since my plan was to hoof it a lot of the way, I got my friend Pete to drive me to the highway, but he insisted on taking me further since he had nothing better to do. He drove me all the way to the Nevada border actually. I thanked him for going out of his way to do that and started my journey. Part of me was just happy to be out of California. It was later in the day, almost evening. I had brought my backpack with your basic supplies. I had a tent, blanket, and a pad. I also had a lot of rice and some water, and also a lot of trail mix and jerky. I didn't want to be bogged down with a lot of stuff. I had money, but I was going to be depending on the generosity of strangers to make it across the country. I began walking down the highway. I was trying to avoid any interstates which I had heard weren't a good place to hitchhike. They were notorious for police, who were always around watching out for that kind of thing. I first got a ride with a younger couple. They were quite nice and affable. They didn't take me very far, however, just to a couple of towns over where they were headed. I thanked them as they dropped me off in the middle of town. It was now dark outside, so I decided to grab a bite to eat at a small cafe while I had the chance. I knew that soon I would probably be relying solely on my food and my pack. I didn't have long to eat before the cafe closed, so when I was done I hiked to the outskirts of town. I set up my tent amongst a small group of trees behind an older building of some kind. It looked to be completely vacant, so I was confident if I left before dawn nobody would notice. When I awoke it was well past daybreak. The sun was beating down on the tent hard and I was sweating. I hurried and packed up my belongings and made my way to the highway through town. This was truly in the middle of nowhere. I was surrounded by a vast desert landscape with mountains way off in the background. It was exhilarating for me. I felt invigorated by the freedom I was feeling for the first time in my life. The day couldn't have been any more perfect this far. I only thought it could get better. Little did I know at the time it was about to take a turn for the worst. Not long after I had left the town and was walking east that I began to feel the effects of the sun bearing down on me. I was sweating profusely and didn't have nearly enough water to compensate for it. I had been walking for several miles and hadn't seen but maybe a handful of cars go by. My expectations for getting rides out here were diminishing fast. About 40 minutes later I could see a semi-truck coming my way. I stuck out my thumb hoping to God that this person would stop and save me from this inferno I was living in. Of course, they didn't and just flew by, seeming to accelerate even faster when they saw me holding out my thumb. Now I was becoming increasingly worried. My water supply was about dried up. My lips were starting to crack. I was praying I would come across some kind of water source. A lake or perhaps even a river. I would have settled for a small puddle even. When I was about to give up and hunker down under some shade and sleep, I saw a truck way off in the distance heading my way. This was my chance. I had to flag this guy down and hope to God he would stop for me. As he approached, I waved my hands out towards him like a lunatic. I felt like an insane person doing so, but I was desperate. To my shock and amazement, he pulled over about 100 feet in front of me. I couldn't believe it. I ran as fast as I could to his passenger side window and thanked him over and over again. I started to explain my situation before he told me to stop it and get in. I was letting out all of the cold air. I didn't argue with him and threw my pack in the bed of the truck and quickly got in the cab with him, shutting the door behind me. He was a somewhat elderly gentleman. I would have guessed mid-60s to early 70s. The cool air hitting me in the face was rejuvenating as I laid back in his seat thanking him again. He reached back behind his seat pulling out a towel and throwing it at me. Here, dry yourself off, you're sweating all over my seat. Oh, I'm so sorry, I told him as I dabbed the towel all over me. I've been out there for hours hoping someone would pick me up. It's so hot out there. Of course, it's hot out there. The man yelled. It's Nevada in the month of May. I laughed and said yeah. I was so appreciative for this ride, I tried to ignore the fact this man was coming off as being extremely unfriendly. Some time went by before either one of us spoke. Then I really couldn't take the tension anymore, so I asked him what his name was. He didn't say a word. He just kept staring forward as if I never even spoke. I really didn't know what to make of this. I just sat there, my hands on my knees trying not to look too nervous. Finally, after about 10 minutes, he took a deep breath and asked me what the hell I was doing out there. I didn't really believe this man would be interested in hearing about my story or the rainbow gathering, so I just told him I was down on my luck and trying to get to my friend's house in Colorado. He once again didn't say anything for some time until he flat out told me he didn't believe it. He told me I was probably up to no good like the rest of my kind. That's when I spoke up out of anger and told him he doesn't know me, and he shouldn't judge me like that. I was very appreciative of the ride, but you shouldn't treat people like this. He then looked over at me and smiled. I then heard him whisper to himself something to the effect of, "The fuck you think you're talking to, motherfucker?" I became increasingly uneasy after that. I noticed we were a few miles from the town, so I told him I had to relieve myself and asked if he could stop there. "There's nothing there," he said. "That's okay, I really have to go." He pulled over to a ditch. "Nobody's out here, just go there," he demanded, and hurry. I got out and quickly grabbed my backpack from the back of his truck and yelled at him, "Thanks for the ride, so long." He slammed on the gas hard, throwing up rocks and dirt in my direction. I used the backpack to shield my face and body. I felt so relieved to be out of his truck, I didn't really care. I was once again out in this intense heat in this strange town. And strange it was. There was nobody there. It was in fact a ghost town. I walked slowly past a few old, abandoned structures and poked around a couple of automobiles that had to be very old, just left out here to bake in the sun, before I finally got back to walking down the highway. I eventually came to a stream and boiled up some water and had a small meal with some rice. I camped there for the night and got an early start in the morning. Not even a mile and a car came flying by me before stopping way ahead and pulling over. As I got closer, a woman stuck her head out of the driver's side window and asked me if I needed a ride. I yelled, "I sure do, thank you." This lady was a breath of fresh air and very easy to talk to. She drove me all the way to Salt Lake City before we parted ways. The weather was a lot more bearable in this region, so I had no trouble at all making it to Colorado eventually. The rainbow gathering was still a few weeks out, so I decided to camp until then. That's when I met Michael. I was walking into the small town I had camped near for supplies when he pulled over and asked me if I needed a ride. He was driving a shabby-looking van and he had long dreadlocks. He totally fit the part of your typical hippie. We had a really great conversation and had a lot in common. He too was going to the rainbow gathering and was living out of his van in the meantime. I told him all about my crazy experience getting here, and he told me basically his whole life story. I felt I had found a potential lifelong friendship with Michael. Before he was about to drop me off back at my camp, he asked me if I would be interested in attending a smaller group function preceding the rainbow gathering. It was kind of the same thing, only on a much smaller scale. Just a group of like-minded people hanging out until the big event. I was ecstatic. Of course, I blurted out. "That sounds awesome." He said it would be quite a long hike to get to it. It was actually on private property, but that the acreage was huge and that the owners never came out that far. He then asked me if I wanted to go tonight, even though it was already late in the afternoon, and that we could just camp halfway and finish getting there the following morning. I normally wouldn't let my guard down so easily with anyone that I had just met, but I was getting really good vibes from him, so I agreed and began to pack up my things. We drove for about an hour down the highway before turning off onto another road, and took it until we eventually came to an overgrown-looking gravel road. He drove up at about a mile before pulling over and parking it just off to the side. "We can walk from here," he then declared. "Okay," I said, but then I found it a little strange that only our vehicle was out here. When I brought up this fact, he told me there were multiple ways to reach the gathering and that most of the people park in the nearby town and hike out to it from there. I didn't question him any further on the subject, and we headed off down an overgrown trail. As we walked down this path, we had a really terrific conversation about the rainbow gatherings and what I could expect. He assured me there were going to be a lot of single women there. We were walking along the path a few miles and when Michael went totally silent and kept making these weird mannerisms. He would look up at the sky through the trees every so often and wave his arms around. I found it to be odd, so after he did it a few times I spoke up and asked him what he was doing. He seemed puzzled by the question as he was looking down at both sides of the trail. "Oh, I'm just clearing cobwebs is all." I laughed and said, "Oh, okay," in a skeptical manner. He didn't find it funny though, so I didn't press him any further. He kept doing it for some time before he stopped on the trail and told me to wait here. I asked him why, and once again seeming unsure, he told me he had to go relieve himself. A few red flags were going off in my mind, but then I remembered how nature can have strange effects on people and thought of all the pot-smoking hippies I had hung out with from school in the past. This calmed me down for the moment. He came back a few minutes later and everything seemed normal again, and we kept going. He still wasn't talking much until he stopped once again and said we should camp in this spot for the night. I didn't disagree. It seemed a good a spot as any, and I was definitely getting tired from the long day. He assured me the gathering wasn't too much further and we would get there in no time the morning. I unpacked my tent and got things squared away ready for the night. I was looking forward to chatting with my new friend while we had some dinner, but Michael said he wasn't hungry. "That's okay," I told him. "I can get a fire going." Michael went into his tent while I gathered some firewood. I cooked up some rice with some beef I had bought at the store. After I had eaten, I still had a little left over. I yelled at Michael, who was still in his tent, that he was welcome to it if he had changed his mind, but he didn't say a word. He had been in his tent dead silent for over 2 hours when I walked over and shook it. "You alive in there?" All of a sudden he started screaming at me to get away. Over and over again, like my presence near him was physically hurting him. I jumped backwards and asked him what was the matter, but again there was nothing but silence. At that moment I started to think I had made a huge mistake trusting this guy so much. His behavior had me freaking out. I wondered if maybe he had taken some bad drugs or something when he unzipped his tent and came out of it completely naked. He stood there staring directly at me. I don't believe he even blinked. He told everything is okay in almost an entirely different voice. "I'm just going through something. It happens now and then. I'll be okay." With that, he crawled back inside his tent and zipped it up. I was flabbergasted. What in the world just happened? Why was he naked? I didn't know what to think or say. By then it was almost dark out. As much as I wanted to leave, I had no idea where I was, and navigating that trail in the darkness seemed like a not-so-good idea. I sat there for a minute and decided I wouldn't say another word to this guy. I didn't know what was happening to him, and I really didn't want to risk triggering him again. I would just sit by the fire for a while and then go inside of my tent. I would leave at first light. I'm not sure I would be sleeping much. Not after that. I probably sat by the fire until around 11 o'clock. He hadn't come out of his tent or said anything, so I felt a little safer. I got into my tent and laid there for what felt like hours, just going over everything in my head. I'm not sure what time it was I fell asleep, but it was around 6 a.m. when I started to hear voices outside. My eyes shot open as I could clearly hear Michael talking to someone. He was pleading with this person who wasn't saying a whole lot. The person had a deep voice and every once in a while would tell Michael, "You will do it." Over and over again the phrase, "You will do it." Then I could hear Michael crying and making these terrible breathing noises. Then I heard Michael say very softly, "But I like him. This one is different. Please." All was silent for a second before the other voice boomed throughout the forest. "You will do it now." By then I was operating on sheer adrenaline. I grabbed my flashlight and opened my tent and shined it directly on Michael, who was standing beside his tent still naked. There was nobody else around that I could see. "Who the hell are you talking to?" I said. "What is going on? What are you going to do?" Then I watched as Michael's mouth opened and the deep voice came out. "Do it now." I literally watched as Michael's facial expression changed after he said that, and a look of extreme panic overtook him. He fell to his knees and scrambled into his tent. I took a few steps back, not knowing what to do, until he came out holding a very large hunting knife. The amount of fear I felt at that moment made it feel like I was running in place for a few seconds before I finally found myself running as fast as I could deep within the forest. I hurried and hid behind a tree, shutting off my light and listening for Michael. I couldn't hear anything. I waited for another minute and was about to run again when I heard him coming close. He was humming to himself. The same bizarre hum over and over again. I froze and kneeled down, trying to stay hidden. He sounded like he was all around me. I tried to keep as quiet as possible. Why doesn't he leave and look somewhere else, I thought to myself. That's when I heard him come sprinting right by me. I ducked down further, trying to stay out of his sight. The faint light of day was starting to come through the trees, but he didn't see me. This was my opportunity to get out of there, but then I remembered my stuff was back at camp. Most of it I didn't care about, but it was my wallet I needed. I couldn't let this psychopath get my information. It had all of my family and friends' contact information and addresses in it. I couldn't risk it falling into his hands and have him come hunt me down, or worse, someone close to me. I started to run back towards my tent. When I got there, there was no sign of him. I reached inside my tent and grabbed my wallet and my water bottle. The rest of the stuff I could replace. I got out of the tent to run when I looked up, and there he was. Back in the direction I had come from. He was about 50 feet from me. He was still holding his knife, looking at me perplexed, when he began to scream a high-pitched scream at the top of his lungs over and over again. He then started to charge right at me. I turned around and ran, looking for the trail we came in on, but didn't see it. I had no time to spare. I ran through the forest non-stop for the rest of that morning. Luckily, I was in good shape. He never caught up with me. I kept going for what seemed like miles. I came to a river and followed it upstream for a while until I came across someone's house. From there I was able to call the police and report the entire incident to them. By the time they got out there where I explained we were, they said there was no sign of him. His car was gone and so was everything at the camp, including my stuff. I don't know what was wrong with that guy, if he was possessed or criminally insane, but I do know I narrowly escaped that night with my life. I'll never trust anyone again so soon like I did him. It still scares me how people can seem so great at first until you actually get to know them.